What it do, YouTube, man? It's your boy LT back with another video, man. And today we got the truth about the 80s basketball. Now, when I think 80s basketball, you got to think Magic and Larry Bird. You also got to think about the drugs, because a lot of people tell me during the 70s and 80s. If I'm wrong, please correct me. I don't mind being wrong. I remember somebody telling me that during late 80s and early 70s, late 70s, early 80s, the NBA was going through a drug problem or something like that with players. I might be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. But, man, when I think of the 80s basketball, the first thing that comes to mind is Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. That's what I think of, the saviors of the basketball nation. For kids to watch it today, for me to watch it growing up, this wouldn't be here without these two guys. These men came in and they did something very important. They showed us love. They gave us hope. They gave us hope. Larry Bird gave me hope, knowing he was a kid from a little bitty town with nothing. He came from dirt. Like, yo, I ain't got it like that. Magic Johnson, same thing. Pretty boy Magic knew exactly what he did. He went in college, did what he did to do. Larry Bird did the same thing, and it's always amazing to see what people think about the 80s basketball. So what we're going to do is we're going to hop into this video, man. But, man, if this is your first time seeing me on your screen or you're a returning subscriber, make sure y'all hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, turn your notifications on, leave me some comments, and let me know who is the greatest player to ever do it in your book, because I'm always wanting to understand people's logic when it comes to stuff like that. Ooh, got it.
Okay. If you've ever been a part of NBA debates that involve discussions about the 1980s, then you know that people can be pretty divided on their opinions on the style and quality of basketball that came from that era, and even about what that era represented. As someone who loves that era of NBA basketball and who has personally watched hundreds of hours throughout my life of it, I feel like I can offer a bit of clarification on how people can accurately view this decade. I want to start by tackling several aspects about the decade and talk about what's true, what isn't true, and what you might have not known. First, we'll start with one of the most argued over topics, defense. The current perception of 80s defense depends on who you ask. If you ask a fan from an older generation...
So, before he even gets into it, I want y'all to understand that the 80s defense was very good. Did they have some slip-ups and that's just so happened to be the ones that we get to see because somebody scored on them? Yes. But when you think about Pistons defense, you think about the Lakers defense, you think about the Celtics defense, they played good defense. The only time they ever got scored on which is any generation, is when they made a mistake. They didn't they didn't rotate correctly, or they didn't see their man was that far behind them. You get what I'm saying? That's the only time.
More often than not, they're going to tell you that defense was greater at that time, that back then, they played grown man defense. They would always punish each other physically back then, and nowadays, they can barely even touch each other. This is their narrative. But if you ask a lot of younger fans, they don't have to deal with the nostalgia bias, but they also have the disadvantage of not actually watching those games. Those younger fans will say things like defense was less advanced back then, and that it was easier to score and not as physical as advertised. There's even compilation videos on YouTube of bad defense from the 80s, where guys are given little resistance and minimal hustle and effort is on display.
Should I react to that, man? If y'all think that's something I should react to, just, like bad defense from the 80s and 90s, and I can break down and be like, that's not bad because of this, or you can see where they were going for, or who made a mistake, and you can see what they made. I might do that. We're going to do that. Yeah,
so what gives? You've got two different groups saying totally opposite things about a specific decade. Well, as usual, the truth lies somewhere in the middle and a little off to the side. Let's start with the facts and details we know about 80s basketball. In today's current NBA, teams average 111.7 points per game, which is really high. It's actually the highest since the days Wilt Chamberlain played basketball. Now, the 1980s was actually very close in total offense. Throughout that decade, teams usually averaged around 109 points per game, which is also a lot of offense. Not only that, but throughout the 80s, teams shot 48% from the field compared to today's 46%. In fact, in terms of field goal...
Who shot that? I need a name check. I need a name check.
But throughout the 80s, teams shot 48%.
Who is this? Somebody know. I know somebody know. I know one of y'all know. Who is this?
From the field compared to today's 46%. In fact, in terms of field goal percentage, the 1980s were the most efficient decade in all of NBA history. I could break down all the statistical league averages in detail, but here's what you need to know. Today, the league is very high scoring. The 2000s were very low, the late 90s were very low, The early 90s were high, and the 1980s were very high. So immediately, at face value, it appears the 80s defensive era narrative has been pretty overblown, based on how many points they were scoring and how efficiently they were scoring. But what we need to understand was that the biggest contributing factor to this was the pace of play. The 1980s was some of the most fast-break, transition-heavy basketball the league has ever seen. In today's game, most of the very high scoring comes from the inflation of three-point attempts. But in the 80s, it was more due to the fact that most games looked like a track meet. The Showtime Lakers of the 80s were famous for this, since Magic Johnson was always pushing the tempo. But it wasn't just them. Many teams played a fast break style, like the Denver Nuggets, who were notorious for their incredibly fast and potent offense, but also a terrible defense. The Pistons, despite their defensive perception, also ran the fast break a lot and could score a ton of points. And there were also teams like Phoenix, Dallas, Portland, and Philadelphia. So transition basketball was pretty much the norm in those days. And what do you get with a lot of fast breaks?
Charles Barkley looked different. Hold on, Charles Barkley was looking a whole lot different. That looked like, yeah, Charlie, what is that? I ain't never seen
basketball was pretty much the norm in those days.
Behind the back.
And what do you get with a lot of fast breaks? Plenty of layups and dunks, which are easier opportunities. Easier opportunities equals a higher field goal percentage. The highest scoring game in NBA history actually came from this era, which was on December 13th, 1983, when the Detroit Pistons defeated the Denver Nuggets in triple overtime, 186 to 184.
What? I gotta watch that. Oh, I gotta watch that. 186?
These were the Pistons, who were known for their physicality, their Jordan rules, and their overall punishing defense. So how in the world could this defensively revered squad be involved in a game where the final score was in the 180s? It's starting to sound like this whole defensive era thing is just a huge myth. Well, we're not done yet, and that brings us to the next aspect that goes somewhat hand in hand with this one, physicality. One of the biggest influences in the different eras that people don't usually think of is the flagrant foul rule. Most of you know the details of the flagrant foul, but for those who don't, it's a foul where unnecessary roughness is used on another player. Many times it's called when there is a blow to the head or strong physical contact that was in no way a play on the basketball. Committing this flagrant foul can be devastating to the team that does it, because it results in either 1 or 2 free throws and maintained possession of the ball, and often an ejection of the player who committed the foul. This is a pretty good rule. It keeps players protected, it keeps players from unnecessary serious injuries, and it often keeps tense moments from escalating into really ugly situations. And this rule did not exist until 1990. That means that in the fullness of the 1980s, almost every hard foul was just considered a common foul. If this is the case, doesn't it make sense to hit the offensive player a little harder to make sure he doesn't get an and one? Doesn't it make sense to put a little extra on it if it means they think twice before attacking the basket next time? The games in the 80s weren't always played with this physically punishing nature, only when they needed to be, like for the Jordan rules or in the NBA playoffs. In the postseason, where every possession and every point counts, players would often exercise this freedom for the sake of trying to win the ball game. It wasn't that this generation of players was naturally more violent, it's that they were allowed to be. The truth is, just like modern basketball, there were players who played great defense, and there were players who played terrible defense. The key differences were the high-octane pace of play and the permissible hard fouls. In the 1980s, it was possible to have both a league where teams could score into the 120s and a league where games would become very physical and the style would change significantly. There was a term back in the day that was common among players, coaches, referees, and commentators: setting the tone. You don't hear it much anymore in today's game, but back then...
Hey, my coach used to always say that. So we had this this big guy on our team. He said, Lonnie, what I want you to do is you go out there and I want you to set the tone. You go up and you put your damn shoulder in somebody's chest. My high school coach used to tell me, you put your shoulder in somebody's chest. You blow by them. You hurt them. You show them that to get some respect in this house to win this game, it's going to be a long motherfucking night, Lonnie. You better go do. And bro, we used to get out there. I was a horrible player, bro. I used to stick my finger in your butt. I don't care. Yeah. You trying to back me down? I step a little left, put my knee right there, and I push my arm in front of you like I was trying to, maneuver around you, let you fall, pull in the chair. Yeah, that's how it was. But today's game, I feel like kids are like, oh no, that's wrong. No, bro. We play the game to win. We not out here to be your friend. We can talk about being friends after the game. When we not on the court. We can talk, maybe. But as long as you're on the court with me, bro, you are the enemy. You see?
It was very important, and it essentially meant that they were coming out of the gates to start the game, setting the tone for the game's pace, style, and physicality. Nowadays, the game is much more consistent in terms of its style and physicality, because the rules have become much more clear on what is acceptable and what's not, what is permissible contact and what isn't.
Ooh.
In the 80s, it was easier for players to control the game and more difficult for the referees to control the game, because pretty much anything goes. For example, it was common for teams like the Celtics and Pistons to be even more physical in matchups with the Lakers, trying to take them out of their finesse style of basketball. They came out of the gates, setting the tone, and oftentimes, it worked. The next aspect is athleticism. You've heard it, and I've heard it. The idea that players back then were slower, weaker, and smaller than modern...
I don't think so. When I see players like, what's the guy we just covered? Tim Chamberlain? Tim Chambers? Bro, hell no, bro. Hell no. I ain't never seen a white boy in this era get up like that. Ain't never on God green earth ever seen a white boy jump up like that. I was amazed. My mom was shook. I was like, what the who? Where y'all find him at? I don't even think. Oh, it just didn't make no sense. So when I think athleticism, yeah, I gotta get that to the 90s. The flying, the I think what make the skilled is what makes the 2020s look good. It's the skill. Cause the between, the cross the back, but all of the little extra moves they can do, they made it look very, very nice. But when it comes down to just athletic ability, I'm giving it to the
day athletes. Is it somewhat accurate? Probably. Is it also grossly exaggerated? Probably that too. In the past 10 years of modern NBA basketball, the average height of the NBA player is 6 foot 7 inches tall and weighs 220.7 pounds. In the 10 years of the 1980s, the average height was also 6 foot 7 inches tall and the average weight was 207 pounds. So although they stood just as tall side to side to one another, the major difference was the weight of the players at nearly 14 pounds less. Simply put, this difference was usually made up of muscle mass. Modern players have an advantage with modern training methods, eating habits, and fitness routines. Guys in the 80s were simply skinnier, but many of them were still very athletic and had lean muscle. They just overall looked a little less physically imposing than today's players. This has partially led some newer fans to criticize this era when they're looking at some of the most non-threatening and least athletic players of the 80s. They'll say things like the league was packed with part-time plumbers and accountants. I hate it when people say this though, because it's easy to take small samples and condemn an entire era for it. It's almost like when people think of the state of athleticism in 2020, they automatically think of Giannis. And when they think of the state of athleticism in the 90s, they think of Jeff Hornacek. The problem with that is that
why they do Jeffy like
it's erring on an extreme example, and isn't a proper survey of the athleticism of the league as a whole at that time. Want another example? Picture 20 years from now. People are hating on LeBron James, saying he didn't play in a strong era of real athleticism, and here's their future arguments. How strong is LeBron's era in 2016 when he lost the MVP race to a guy who struggles to dunk a basketball? How strong could that era have been when one of the best players in the league was someone who was consistently overweight? And LeBron's era, he played against plumbers like J.J. Redick and Kelly Olynyk. How weak were the athletes in LeBron's era if a guy who was only 5 foot 9 inches tall could average nearly 30 points per game? Don't you guys see how ridiculous and biased these statements are? Although many of the statements are true to an extent, they're cherry-picking details and acting as if it's the complete picture. They're completely lacking context, but statements like these are usually just emotionally motivated agendas in order to build a negative narrative about a player that they don't like as much as their favorite player. People do this all the time with the 1980s. But when you look around the league in that era as a whole, you see guys who were incredible athletes like Dominique Wilkins, Kenny Skywalker, Michael Jordan, Daryl Dawkins, Charles Barkley, Gerald Wilkins, Julius Erving, Sean Kemp, Xavier McDaniel, Hakeem Olajuwon, Karl Malone, James Worthy, Tom Chambers, Darrell Griffith, David Thompson, Terrence Stansbury, Clyde Drexler, Larry Nance, Dennis Rodman, Orlando Woolridge, David Robinson, Roy Hinson. Seriously, do I need to keep going?
God.
Many people are just too young or weren't watching at that time to know about a lot of the freakishly gifted athletes of the 1980s, just like how 20 to 30 years from now, many people won't know about many of the great athletes we watch in today's game.
Facts.
The final aspect is competition. I'll make this one quick, but since the 1960s, when the Boston Celtics ruled the basketball world, the 1980s were the toughest era of competition in terms of how hard it was to break through and win a championship. That was because the 80s were as a...
Hold on, man. I gotta stop. I gotta stop real quick. Because this is for all my... This is for all my this is for my real ones, for my Larry Bird fans, my Michael Jordan fans, my Magic Johnson fans. If you love the 80s, I want you to turn this part on right here. Put it on loud. You got kids in the room? You feel what I'm saying? You got kids in the room? Listen to what I say. I want to make this very well. I want to make it very clear. This man just literally just said competition was at its greatest during the 80s and 90s. Do you understand what I'm saying? That means every team had a team that could go somewhere, that could beat somebody, that could give you buckets. You could go down to Charlotte and Charlotte could drop you off. The Lakers with the team that they had in the 80s could have went down there and lost to Charlotte because that team was actually good. Chicago loses to the Boston all the time. These are just teams. Every team was built to last. Every team. It wasn't, we know for sure LeBron James is going to the finals. Oh, it's for sure Stephen Curry. KD's he's gonna win. There's no for certain. We're like, oh, fucking no, man. I mean, Celtics got Larry. Chicago got Bird. Got Michael. You got Magic with the Lakers. You got Steve Nash and what's his name? They got the Jazz. You got the Houston. They got Elijah Wan. You got all this stuff. Shaq got Magic. Kareem. The Sonics. They got Kemp. Everybody had a team. Everybody. So I don't want to hear that it was ever not any competition, bro. It was not, bro. Come on, man. Just come on, good stuff.
I call it the era of super teams. There was so much talent at the top of the league, and you had several dynasty-worthy rosters consistently duking it out. Part of that was how the league was rich with stars, but the other part was how there were only 23 teams in the league. Imagine today's NBA, and then we eliminate 7 of the teams, and then distribute the talent from those teams to the remaining 23 teams. Naturally, what would you get? A handful of super teams. This was essentially the NBA in the 1980s.
Thank you.
Look around the teams of the league and who won championships in that decade. If you had just 1 or 2 stars on your team in that era, you're not winning a championship. You needed 3 or 4 and a deep bench just to even win 1 ring. With all this being said, am I saying that the 80s was the greatest era of basketball?
To me,
not necessarily, but it was a great era, with a crazy history, and with a fantastic collection of talent and athletes, and it certainly deserves your respect. Let me know in the comments section which decade you think had the greatest collection of talent. Thanks for watching as always.
The greatest collection of talent has to go to the 80s and 90s. I think the 2000s had a decent collection too, but I don't think it matches, the 80s or the 90s. So yeah, that's just what it is, man. But if you guys did enjoy this video and y'all want to see more basketball reactions or anything like that on this channel, make sure y'all hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, turn your notification on. We got a long way to go to 4,000, but we on our way, and I know we're going to get there very soon, man. But LT is out. Peace.